Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Today I have a super good subject for you. We're going to talk all about orchid roots, specifically how to promote new root growth and also how to maintain them healthy throughout their growth, which I know is a subject many people want me to make a video on. I will make sure to put chapters down below. You can skip around if you want to reach to a certain subject, but if you're a beginner, I do suggest that you watch this video throughout because the most important thing for you is to learn how your orchid works. That will help you in the future because intuitively you will know what to do or what to expect from your orchid. Today's video, together with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by repotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid. From potting mixes to pots, fertilizers, and all sorts of accessories, they have it all. And their products are super good. I tried a whole bunch of them and I'm still using some. Now, if you're into other types of plants, they do have something for you as well. They are expanding their line for other types of houseplants. So I'll link you to their website down below. Feel free to check them out at any time. And with that said, let us start with number one. What exactly triggers new root production on our orchid? Now, if you've owned an orchid for quite a while, you might have noticed that they do seem to produce new roots all of the time. Sometimes a little bit more abundantly, sometimes not so much, but typically they will always produce brand new roots. They will not only rely on the older roots. And that is a sort of regeneration mechanism. For an orchid, the older the roots, the bigger the chances they are damaged or they just don't function properly anymore. Even though, yes, they are very well protected and sheltered in our living rooms, their ancestors living in the wild, they kind of adapted some mechanisms to always refresh their root system so that the system altogether works at full capacity and provides what the orchid needs. So naturally, your orchid will always produce new roots. And you will discover that sometimes in some seasons it will produce more roots, depending on the orchid, of course, and in some seasons it will not. We're gonna get to that, don't worry, but bottom line, it is absolutely normal for any orchid to constantly produce new roots as it grows and develops. What actually triggers root production is a certain hormonal balance in the orchid. The presence of certain hormones in certain quantities will determine what structure needs to be grown. If conditions are met for root production, then the orchid will naturally grow those roots due to the hormonal balance inside. Now, this balance can be affected by external factors. Factors such as temperature, light even, humidity levels or water levels, or water availability, they all can determine an orchid to produce roots or not. Pretty much, this is how the orchid tells if it's the growing season, winter, summer, whatever that might be, or the flowering season, or the dormancy season for some orchids. And according to these external factors, the orchid will decide that it will produce new leaves, new roots, flowers, or it will not produce anything at all and go into this dormant state for, of course, some species. But these factors are not the only ones that determine root production. Sometimes even physical damage can trigger such a response. Loss of a root system can actually trigger the response of the orchid actually focusing more on another root system production than, let's say, blooming. Reason why: rootless, sick, dehydrated orchids will prioritize getting healthy, getting hydrated, producing vital structures, than blooms. Hence why sometimes orchids don't want to bloom. Again, it has to do with the internal balance of hormones and other substances that dictate what the orchid needs to do next to ensure its survival. Bottom line, orchids naturally and quote-unquote instinctively will produce roots when they need to, based on their pattern of growth throughout the year or what actually happens to them. Do they lose structures? Do they lose roots? Are the roots they have enough? Are they healthy? And so on. So knowing this aspect actually gives us an idea of how we ourselves can actually promote, to some extent at least, root production on an orchid and maintain it healthy. And before we go into that, I would just like to say that I am personally not the type of grower which resorts to additives or hormone addition when it comes to root production. And for beginners, I definitely would not advise you to go spend your money on plant hormones without knowing what they do, how to dose them. There are very old growers who do indeed have some success when it comes to root production using all sorts of hormones. But it is a tricky business. Hormones are not something we need to play with because they are the thing that dictates how something will grow and how it will function. And we can have all sorts of bad outcomes if we misuse it. So for today, I will not advise you to buy these additives, but tell you how you can promote and maintain good roots at home without having to buy anything and with stuff you already have at hand. And afterwards, we get a little bit more knowledgeable with orchids. Absolutely, you can go ahead and research and try whatever experiments you want with your orchid. Let's just focus on what we can actually do in our homes to promote roots. One factor which promotes new roots that we can control in our homes is actually temperature. The warmer, the better for root production. Now, many orchids do have in their natural habitat a drier season and a more rainy season. We can call them summer and winter, although definitely it does not get very cold, but in the drier seasons, typically the temperatures are lower. And in these seasons, orchids are more prone to bloom and not grow vegetatively. This is why Phalaenopsis actually do require a little bit of a cool down, which if you don't know about, I do have a video, check it down below in the description. While in the warmer season, summer, for many of us, they will not be triggered to produce new flower spikes, but rather leaves and new roots. So in this example, keeping a Phalaenopsis orchid rather warm will help us trigger vegetative growth rather than flower spikes, which can happen if your home is a little bit too cold. And the Phalaenopsis is not the only one. Dendrobium nobilis and other types of dendrobiums, which do naturally have a difference in temperature between winter and summer in their natural habitats, will act the same. The warmer, the better for vegetative growth in these cases. For other orchids such as Cattleyas, Vandas, even Oncidiums, keeping them warm is pretty much keeping them in the conditions they like. For example, Cattleya orchids, they're not cool growers, and typically, even though they will tolerate lower temperatures in a home if they're not under 15 degrees Celsius, but I think you might have noticed that in the cooler months, they don't actually grow as much. Obviously, there are exceptions like Miltoniopsis, Draculas mastivalias. Those are orchids which more experienced growers grow. Obviously, in those cases, keeping them warm might not be a very good idea. But for most of these orchids which we can buy from the flower shop, warmth is good. And even though it is not the only factor that can trigger new root production, it definitely helps. So keep your orchids rather warm. Don't go overboard. Don't keep them next to a heater. But definitely at about 24 degrees Celsius should be just fine for the vast majority of the orchids that you can buy from the flower shop. Next factor we can actually control is humidity, and this goes hand in hand with temperature. Because typically when temperatures are more elevated in their natural habitat, the rain is more abundant as well, making the environment itself more humid. Now in your living room, you can actually opt for a humidifier or maybe a dome on top of the orchid. That's a little tricky because if you don't ventilate the orchid, you can run into molds and other things. But one of the things that I actually do believe made a difference for me is promoting a more humid environment at the base, right where the root system should grow. So in the case of Phalaenopsis, at the base of the central stem. In the case of other orchids, right there at the rhizome level. To achieve this, you can actually opt for a layer of sphagnum moss on the surface. Sphagnum moss retains a lot of water, and because it has this spongy consistency, it's also going to improve evaporation of that water, so keeping that little space there around the roots more humid. And in my experience, this is about enough. You actually don't need to put this orchid necessarily under a glass cloche or things of the sorts. Just adding a little bit of sphagnum moss on top of the potting medium temporarily, not indefinitely, I do find that it can help with root production. Phalaenopsis are generally very vigorous. They don't need a lot of hassle to promote some new roots and will typically be triggered into new root production by themselves without you actually having to do much if you keep them a little bit more on the warm side. But there are orchids that are much more sensitive and more reluctant to produce roots, such as oncidiums. I actually do like to make a sort of an ICU chamber. This is how I call it. It is either a vase or a jar or something of the sorts with some sphagnum moss at the bottom. I don't cover it with a lid or anything, but I do sit the orchid right there on top of the sphagnum moss. This maintains the environment a lot more humid, but also ventilated at the same time. I would not necessarily do this for a Phalaenopsis because it's vigorous, but with oncidiums and other, let's say, more fragile orchids, even cattleyas, I found quite a lot of success in assembling this ICU, which not only helps me trigger the new roots, but also maintain them growing healthy. We'll get to it, don't worry. So I'll link you down below to my ICU setup. Maybe it will inspire you. But yeah, the second trigger, quote unquote, for new roots is humidity, and there are various ways to promote a little bit of a higher humidity around the rooting area, at least, of your orchid. And third, just good old patience. As I was saying, the orchid herself already has a mechanism that alerts it when there aren't enough roots or when all of the roots are gone, so it will prioritize root production. Case in which we don't necessarily need to do anything other than just offering this good environment for the new roots to grow properly. And this renders the use of additives and hormonal pastes and things of the sorts rather useless. Yes, there will be some cases with some more stubborn orchids, and there are some cases in which not even additives will help us. We'll get to them. But in the vast majority of cases, and with all of the orchids that you see for the past 8 years on my channel, I did not actually use any additives in order to promote new roots. They just grew roots by themselves because this is what they're programmed to do. This is natural for them. They want to survive, and in order to survive, they are smart enough, quote unquote, to know what to prioritize. There will be exceptions, especially with the man-made hybrids, but in the vast majority of cases, all orchids will prioritize their roots if they become rootless. Alrighty, so we are at the stage where tiny little roots are starting to form. Our job is not done yet. There are still some things that can totally obliterate our precious new roots, so we need to be careful with them. And the very first factor is snails or slugs or potentially other pests that can munch on the brand new root tips. Now, slugs and bush snails are the most common ones, at least in some territories of the world, and they have been a headache for me when I was a beginner until I figured out that I do need to get rid of them. Snails will feast on the very fresh new root tips. And the problem is, if the root tip is damaged and destroyed, the root will not continue to grow. And another further problem is that very tiny roots do not branch out. They need to have a certain length to branch out, I have observed in my experience. So what happens is, by destroying that root tip, we completely destroy the potential of that root ever growing again. The root area of an orchid is limited. It will not be able to grow indefinite numbers of roots due to space constraints, of course, and also due to parts of the orchid which are not yet fully developed to produce roots. For example, with Vanda orchids, the root area extends, let's say, up until here. Everything upwards is not ready to produce roots yet. So if all of the roots up until here are destroyed, the orchid will not start to produce roots from the crown or from the upper areas. It's just not ready to do that. The tissue itself is not ready. So in this case, without any spaces to produce roots, the orchid will just fizzle out and die off. And you can imagine, if you have enough of a snail infestation to destroy all of the root tips, at some point the orchid will run out of space, energy, and locations for producing new roots. So it's a very big problem that you really need to address. My way of addressing it is by using hydrogen peroxide 3%, which many of you already know from my channel. I've been using it for the past 8 years without bad effects, only good effects. There is really nothing worse than a snail destroying the new roots on your orchid, which already struggles. If it's already dehydrated and struggles and is sick, the last thing you want to do is destroy the brand new root tips. In the long run, it does 1,000,001% more good than harm. But of course, other people have other methods. Just so you know though, snails, and particularly the bush snail, is a real threat to fresh new roots, and you absolutely need to address it if you ever see holes or munches on the new roots. Next thing that can seriously mess up our new roots is physical damage. We don't necessarily need snails to destroy the root tips. There are other things that can, such as ourselves, by mistake. It absolutely happens. By not being careful when we repot the orchid, when we pot it up, or simply by not properly stabilizing it in the pot, and due to the abrasion with the medium, the root tips can get damaged. So a very important thing, particularly with rootless orchids, is to stabilize them. And there are many ways in which you can. I prefer bamboo skewers with a little clip or a tie if the pseudobulb is too big. And as much as possible, not move it around or wiggle it too much. Definitely not dropping it on the floor. So physical damage should be avoided. Sphagnum moss is a very safe medium, very mild on the roots. If you want, you can put a bit of sphagnum moss on the top until the new roots go down. Then you can remove it if it starts to have algae and things of the sorts. But yeah, just try to limit physical damage that can destroy the root tips. Root damage can also be chemical in nature. For example, if the potting medium we're using is breaking down, is very old and not suitable anymore, it can become very, very acidic, too acidic in fact. And that can burn roots, and particularly root tips, which are the most sensitive since they're so fresh, which is why we need to make sure that we do our repottings in time and we use fresh quality medium, because again, if we lose the new roots, especially with rootless orchids, we are in big trouble with that orchid. So make sure your potting medium is nice and fresh. Also, make sure that you do not have salt deposits on top of your medium. That's where the new root tips first touch the potting mix you're using. If you're fertilizing a little bit too much, all of those salts can actually accumulate at the surface because this is where they dry the fastest. The inside of the medium can still be moist, but the very top will always dry out way before the inside of the medium, creating that layer of unutilized salts. Same goes for hard water. If you're using too hard of a water all the time, you might have a little bit of deposits again in time. That can damage root tips. It's not always going to happen, but sometimes it can happen. So if you see the root tips becoming blackened and just shriveled, that is a sign of a burn. If you know that you didn't snap that root, then definitely it's burned. So you need to be careful how much you fertilize, and if you're fertilizing with the correct type of fertilizer, or if you're using hard water, or even more if you're using organic fertilizers, maybe you have an organic buildup in the pot. It might be that you have an acidic environment. Whatever you do, make sure you don't overdo it, whatever type of fertilizer you're using. And if you're afraid that you're gonna have buildup, once a month or so, just flush the pot. Run just plain water through the pot. Make sure you water it and soak it very, very well. You can actually soak the pot for 10 minutes, take it out, then run water just to dissolve those salt deposits if there are any, and just stay on top of repotting. Now, maintaining the roots on your orchid in good condition long term is not hard. If you remember that most of the orchids we grow, whether it's a Phalaenopsis, Cattleya, Oncidium, Dendrobium, except slipper orchids, most of them are epiphytes. So they do actually love to have ventilation around their roots. But at the same time, they do like their moisture as well. Moisture is what keeps those roots growing, is what makes sure that nutrients are available for the roots. If the medium is dry, the roots cannot absorb nutrients. Obviously, they cannot absorb water either. But a good ratio between moisture and air is, in my experience, the absolute key to keeping your roots healthy further on. So I would advise to keep your orchid in an adequate pot that has ventilation slits or holes, definitely has drainage, and keep a medium that is both water retentive to some extent, but also airy, very, very airy. Using bark chips, coconut husk even, and if you need some extra humidity or extra moisture, even sphagnum moss in combination will make sure that the roots will have ventilation and moisture at the same time. But really, to keep them healthy, if you just make sure that you repot the orchid in time, you don't overdo it with the fertilizer, whatever fertilizer you're using, you don't overdo it with watering way too often, keeping the air pockets filled with water all the time, you should be just great. There's no magic to it. Offer water and moisture at the same time. Keep the medium a little bit water retentive, but also very, very airy. And that's the whole key to maintaining the roots healthy. Stick to these two very, very, very basic things. So now let's troubleshoot a little bit why some orchids simply do not want to produce new roots. First and foremost, growth pattern. Most of the orchids we grow in our homes do not have dormancies, don't really take breaks from growing. Even Phalaenopsis, who do have a blooming season and more of a vegetative season, they actually never go dormant, they actually don't take breaks, and it's not uncommon to see them growing leaves, roots, and flowers at the same time if conditions are good. Slipper orchids are the same, oncidiums are the same, cattleyas are the same, they don't go dormant. But there are some orchids which do. There are some dendrobiums which completely lose all of their leaves. There are also catasetum orchids and a few others that can go through dormancies. At this point, the orchid does not grow anything. It prepares for flowering typically, and root production is out of the question. No matter how many additives you might try to use, some of these orchids will simply not budge. There might be some hybrids in between which can be influenced to some extent, but if you especially have a species with a very, very determined growing season and pronounced dormancy, it's just not gonna happen because that's the nature of things. Then we have orchids with very, very strict growth patterns, and this is where cattleyas, for the main part, fit in. Cattleyas don't go dormant. They do grow something pretty much at all times throughout the year, whether they're developing buds in the sheath, blooming, producing roots, or new growth. At some point in the year, they will do something. They will not lose their leaves or anything. But some of them, especially some species, do have a very pronounced season or timing for producing roots. Some cattleyas will only produce new roots after they bloom. Some of them will produce new roots when the new growth starts, and that might only happen in springtime. Any other time of the year, they will simply not produce roots. This is why with cattleyas in particular, it is a good idea to know what type of cattleya we have, and if we don't know, it is a good idea to repot and mess around with the root system when we see new roots starting to grow, because we are absolutely sure new roots are on their way. Even if we lose the old system, there is a new system on the way, because the worst thing that can happen with a cattleya, and it happened to me quite a few times, is to repot it and mess up the root system. Now be careful with the root system at the wrong time. I had to wait for an entire year for new roots to sprout, time at which the orchid was already depleted, dehydrated. Not a good situation. What we can do in that situation is just try to limit transpiration. Keep the orchid more humid than you typically keep it. Maybe keep it in the ICU, that little setup I told you about earlier, for the remainder of the year until new roots start to grow. Sometimes it will fail, sometimes it will work. Additives don't really do much in this circumstance because the orchid knows the order in which things need to be done. If the order is new growth first and then roots, then no matter how many additives you put on the rhizome, it's just not gonna work out. It's sometimes not going to produce any type of root anywhere. And lastly, of course, all sorts of ailments which might not be very visible. Starting from viruses to just bad genetics. Some orchids are just not vigorous, are just not going to respond to external factors, and will just not work normally due to the ailment or the bad genetics that influences their growth. And it happens a lot in cultivation, particularly with very complex hybrids, man-made hybrids, which prioritize the looks rather than the functionality. There are those hybrids which are simply not vigorous, which will simply refuse to do something no matter what, no matter the additives, external factors, whatever you name it. And it doesn't happen very often, so don't worry, but it just happens sometimes. And really, there's nothing we can do to promote roots than just be patient and hope that one day the orchid will decide to produce roots, and that obviously is not very, very sick with something that we cannot treat. So those were the main points that I think you should be aware of. Even though I went through all of the possibilities, most of the times, 95% of the times, orchids are absolutely savable, particularly Phalaenopsis, particularly the ones at the flower shop. So I'll be sure to link you in the description to more videos of how I saved particular orchids. and I hope it will help you out. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's video, and I hope it will help you out in the future with your orchids. Thank you, Repot Me, for sponsoring yet another Orchid Care for Beginners episode. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!